Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Rudensky. I'm the Senior Director for Education and Visitor Services here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's professional development program, which is part 2 of our series, Teaching the Holocaust Through Film. Today's session will focus on documentary films. For our first session, which was on March 24th, Professor Avi Pott spoke about using feature films to teach about the Holocaust. Over the course of the session, Professor Pott discussed why the Holocaust should be taught and how this can best be achieved. Professor Pott included feature films in this discussion and examined important films depicting the Holocaust, such as Long is the Way, Europa, Europa, Schindler's List, Conspiracy, The Pianist, Defiance, Son of Saul, Zone of Interest, and others. Professor Pott also looked at some of the pitfalls in using films, cautioning the attendees on which films to avoid. Today, we will look at documentary films, and we will take a deep dive into a new documentary that can be used in the classroom. Family Treasures, Lost and Found tells the story of writer and editor Karen A. Frenkel's family and their experiences in the Holocaust. Family Treasures was created in collaboration with Marcia, an Emmy Award-winning director. Let me tell you a little bit about both Ms. Frenkel and Professor Rock. Karen A. Frenkel is a science and technology journalist, editor, author, and documentary producer. Her previous award-winning documentaries covered the impact of technology on society and appeared on public television. In pursuit of finding out more about her family's life before and during World War II in Europe, Ms. Frenkel started the Family Treasures Lost and Found project, which is now a 75-minute documentary and memoir. Her articles have appeared in both print and online publications, including Bloomberg BusinessWeek, the New York Times, Scientific American, The Village Voice, and many others. Marcia Rock has produced 13 documentaries since 1984 and received many awards, including 3 local Emmys and several nominations. Her work covers international dilemmas, women's issues, and personal histories. Among her many works, her one-hour documentary, Dancing with My Father, from 2003, ponders how adult love is shaped by what a child learns at home, and her 30-minute documentary, Surrender Tango, from 2006, compares the rules and roles of tango with contemporary relationships. She is co-author with Marlene Sanders of Waiting for Prime Time, The Women of Television News. Her films are currently in distribution with Cinema Guild, Filmmakers Library, Amazon.com, and Women Make Movies. Professor Rock teaches at NYU and is Director of News and Documentary at the NYU Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. We hope that this seminar will answer questions you may have had about using documentaries in your classroom, and that it will give you more tools for your pedagogic toolbox. We are looking forward to a meaningful and productive program today. In order to maximize our experience together, we ask you for the following. We ask that you stay for the whole program if possible. This will also maximize the number of CTLE hours you will earn. Please take notes, and after the program today, we will be sending out an evaluation form and in a CTLE form. Please take a few minutes to complete the form. Your feedback is important to us and helps us to develop more and better programs for you. If you wish to receive CTLE credit, please make sure that your screen name matches the name that you will use to apply for credit. I would like to also make a shout out to my colleagues Rachel Litt and Aliyah Shon for their help in bringing this program to fruition. A special shout out as well to Professor Avi Pott. Our program today is part of the Fania Gottesfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series, and is made possible through the sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, Fania Gottesfeld Heller, Zichrono Livracha, and Joseph Heller, Zichrono Livracha. It is also made possible through the generous support of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. The program is co-sponsored by the New York University Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. This is just one of our many professional development programs for educators, and we hope you will join us for other programs as well. The final session of this series will be on May 4th and will feature Professor Avi Pott. We'll focus on using recorded survivor testimonies in teaching the Holocaust. Stay tuned for more offerings later in the spring and throughout the summer. For more information and to register for any of these programs, please check your email for our e-blast featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website, www.mjhnyc.org and click events. Please make sure your screen name matches your personal name so that we will have an accurate record of your attendance. And I think that's enough for an introduction. I'm now pleased to turn over the microphone to Professor Marcia Rock and to Ms. Karen Frenkel. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to say how honored we are to be here. We've been thinking about you, the teachers, and how we can best serve you and help you understand how to bring this difficult subject of the Holocaust and the important subject into the classroom. So I want to go over a few things before we get into our case study, which is the film that we produced together. So we think that bringing audiovisual materials into the classroom is a great way to make the Holocaust not the past, but the present. And because the Holocaust occurred 80 years ago, it can seem very distant. Now, one way to make it relevant is through documentaries that provide history, archival footage, survivor testimony. Many documentaries focus on one topic, like women partisans who fought for 4 years, survivor testimony along with family stories, resistance fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, while others present the big picture historical perspectives of the entire war, like the US and the Holocaust by Ken Burns. Most documentaries follow personal stories, so audiences can identify, and there are a lot of stories about specific families' experiences. With all that, Karen and I produced a 75-minute feature documentary, and then we thought, wouldn't it be great to break this down into 5 parts, small sections, so that teachers could use it in the classroom and have time to talk about the issues that are brought up. Our goal when translating the feature to the parts was to create empathy, foster inquiry, and media literacy. In Holocaust education, you're always balancing the idea of the emotional impact and bringing that live into the classroom, as well as conveying historical and critical knowledge at the same time. Now, we have approached these 5 parts with the critical issues for Holocaust education. What was the Holocaust? The social historical context, research techniques, anti-Semitism, identity, racism, resistance, complicity in violence, immigration, and refugees. So we are now in the post-survivor area, and it's people like Karen who can help continue the telling of the story. Karen.
Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to have you here and to interact with you later on in the Q&A. As Marcia said, the children of Holocaust survivors are now beginning to tell their parents' stories, and I am one of them. And so you learn about my family story from both sides, my father's and my mother's side. And we cover issues that we think will be relatable for your students. I feel very strongly that we're not wired to understand and absorb the persecution and murder of millions, but that through the plights of individuals, we can reach the listeners. And so I used my skills as a journalist to investigate the past and fill the gaps in my parents' wartime stories. And then I expanded that into the experience of my sole surviving grandparent, my father's father, and his path to freedom. I also used the world's archives, scoured the world's archives to find out more about my lost grandparents and uncle. And in a way, this is it was an excellent time really in the night from 2014 on when I began this to start on this quest, because the world's archives are being digitized, and that has the effect of democratizing them so that you can do the research from your desk, from your computer, and you can also visit them as people have in the past, but they are in no way, these experiences are in no way dusty archival, experiences in the stacks someplace anymore for those archives that have been digitized. I also went to the relevant cities. My father was born in Lvov, Poland, which is now Lviv, Ukraine, and went to school in Vienna, to medical school. And my mother was born in Krakow, and the city Tarnow, which is about an hour away, was very important to her survival, as you'll see in the film. So we show in the film how I pieced together the facts of these unspoken tales, and you'll see the particulars as we go through each segment.
So the 5 parts were based on the way that we actually worked on the feature, which was the 5 parts of oral history, and how you do family research. So we started with oral history, Google anything, which should make the students happy, sleuthing archives, the value of visiting, and then building a family tree. Most of the segments are 15 minutes or under, except for one which is 30, and could be organized in 2 classes, 3 classes, depending on the time you have. We also suggest that you spend some time going over the basics of what was the Holocaust. And we, in our discussion guide, which we'll show you at the end, we suggest the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or the Museum of Jewish Heritage here as a way to introduce the terminology, etc. So the way this evening will work, or this afternoon, is that we're going to, in a sense, role play with you and show you tiny little excerpts from the 5 parts and talk about what is relevant and how to present them and the issues they bring up to your classes. So the part 1 is oral history, and we believe that it is so important that students understand that people's identities were not only that of victims or survivors. They came from vibrant communities. The Polish Jewish community was extremely vibrant. People really had great lives, and it's really important that students understand that they were people like any of us. Until the Nuremberg laws started to reduce their identity to that of one thing, being a Jew. And Jews were not allowed to own a car, telephones, read newspapers. They weren't allowed to be doctors, lawyers, architects. Jews could only shop during certain hours, and they were not permitted to sit on park benches. I think this really brings home the crisis of Nazis' influence on their lives in the beginning. So we're going to show you now a clip from oral history that features the background of Karen's mom. I'm running the show here, so if there are any bumps in the road, please forgive me, okay?
And this is the last picture of my mother with her mother in Krakow.
39, May, with my mother near the theater. We're going to dressmaker.
Oral histories are the first stop when you become interested in reporting your family's stories, because you want to capture the memories of eyewitnesses who lived through key events in history. When I became a journalist, I was very frustrated because my mother wouldn't really sit down to do a formal interview with me in the tape recorder, but I was able to convince her to participate in the Yale Fortunoff Video Archives, which was one of the first efforts to report Holocaust survivors. And I'm so thankful that she did it, even though she was reluctant to do it with me, because now I can play it over again, I can study it.
We will ask you to identify yourself and where you were born.
I lived in Krakow. I was a Polish citizen. It was chic to have only one child at the time, which I resented quite a bit. I was not aware of the fact that I was Jewish until I went to school, and for the first time, somebody called me a dirty Jew. And I didn't know what that meant. It was an assimilated family. I was never in synagogue until I was 13 and went there alone. It was a very close family, my aunts and uncles. We always celebrated Passover. My grandparents would come from Berlin.
These are my great-grandparents' Passover dishes. And there are 18 place settings, so we know that they entertained lavishly in their apartment in Berlin. They packed these dishes, paintings, and photographs when their son Max in New York finally got them visas. They were twice refugees. At the beginning of World War I, they fled Krakow for Berlin. So my grandmother spent her teen years in Berlin, and then she married back, as my mother used to put it, to Krakow, as did her sisters, Isa and Lutza, but their parents stayed in Berlin.
Germany moved into Austria. They crossed and met with no opposition, and those who dissented either stayed away or feigned enthusiasm.
Krakow was inundated with Jewish refugees when the Germans annexed Austria in 1938.
I had the perception that we were in danger, which nobody around me had. I spent a lifetime trying to understand why I had that perception. Perception is a responsibility. Hannah Arendt mentioned that children not burdened by experience and education had sort of an open slate and saw the reality easier, some of us do, than our elders. What has puzzled me for many years, how early did my perception of the death of my people evolve? I read all the stories of Karl. I read all about the Indians, and I could recognize the symptom of people that are doomed.
Karl May was a German author whose books on the American West and Native Americans greatly influenced Middle and Eastern European children who learned about the plight of Native Americans through his many novels. And my mother credits his work with opening her eyes to the prejudice and the impending catastrophe that the Jews would face.
Karen.
So one thing that you can discuss with your students and might emphasize is that my mother, at the time that war broke out, was about the same age that they were. She was 14 and a half. And when the war was over, she had just turned 21. And her coming of age really consisted of discussing with and often arguing with her parents about the best way to survive, as certain edicts and events took place in Lvov, where they were refugees having fled from Krakow. And she talks about her growing understanding of anti-Semitism, probably in the first weeks that she attended kindergarten or first grade, I'm not sure which, but no one had ever called her a dirty Jew before, and it's possibly because she was from a very sheltered, assimilated urban Jewish background where her aunts and uncles were professionals. One aunt was a doctor. Her father was an attorney. His brother was an attorney with him in practice, and another set of uncles were architects. And they felt that they fitted into the Krakow society at large. So it was very unexpected for her, this insult. And her family was still benefiting from the liberalization of laws in the mid-19th century on the part of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, under whom Poland was, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he enabled Jews to enter the professions, and they were also admitted to universities. And then there came a backlash to that. Starting in the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War. So our discussion guide gives some background, a little more detail about that time in history when things were better for Jews. They were able to provide better for their children and give them better nutrition, so families were much larger. The other thing that I wanted to say about this part of this segment of the part one is the reference to the books of Karl May. Karl May was a German novelist, and most children, I'm told, from Middle Europe and Eastern Europe adored his novels, which depicted a relationship, a very close friendship between a German expat in the Wild West and a Native American chief. And my mother credits having read about the Wild West and understanding the plight of Native Americans, and having read The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, for recognizing the symptoms of the doomed. Those are her words, and doomed people. And so one way to engage students with this very difficult subject is to ask if they've ever read something that caused them to realize that their understanding of what was happening was more accurate or realistic than their parents. You can ask, have you ever had a moment when you recognized something important and the adults around you on whom you depended were not able to see things as you did? And what was that like? What was the frustration? What was that like? And in my mother's case, this came to a head with the announcement of the Nazis in Lvov, of the formation of the Lvov ghetto. And she perceived the need for having false papers that would enable her and her parents to survive posing as Catholics. And they did not see that right away. In the end, my mother succeeded and won that argument, as you'll see, but it was quite a battle.
So as we go through Karen's mother's story, Irina's story, we can see how the dehumanizing and Nazi propaganda played out in Lvov. And it developed and built into the Lvov pogrom, where many neighbors killed neighbors and raped people. And we have something to show you about that.
After my mother and her parents fled Krakow when the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, they fled east to Lvov, where coincidentally my father was from. And it had just fallen to the Soviets, who had a secret agreement with the Nazis to partition Poland into East and West. Life under the Soviets was very difficult. The city was flooded with refugees from the West. There were job and food shortages. The Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews were pitted against one another, and there was tremendous tension. And then Hitler broke his agreement with Stalin, and his forces took the city of Lvov in late June 1941. Shortly after the Nazis arrived, they incited the Ukrainians to attack and murder the Jews. And they recorded the violence for propaganda purposes.
So you can see that there were a lot of difficult choices in terms of actually making this documentary in portraying the violence of the Holocaust. And this was our first confrontation with it. And we had an advisor who cautioned us to stay away from the pornography of violence, that the images of people in the concentration camps, the bones, the killing of people falling into pits, be very careful, because these were real people and we should show some dignity to their lives. So that, I think, is something you might want to share with your students. You know, how do you handle this kind of imagery? Another interesting thing to do with them is also some research into sexual violence in war. And there's, of course, Bosnia, Haiti, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ukraine, and of course, throughout history, forces have used rape as a form of suppression. The other thing for oral history that we could wrap up with is to actually give them an oral history performance task. So that could be interviewing an immigrant in your family, a friend, a teacher, someone you don't even know that you know is an immigrant. And we have provided a list of questions in the discussion guide to help them do those interviews, and then to bring them to class to discuss what it's like to leave your home, to be in a new place, to adapt, and all the stressors and pressures on you. So then we move on to part 2, which picks up Karen's father's family. And it's called Google Anything because it's fun to think about how Karen started her path to find out where her family lived. Hold on one second. Here we go. Okay. I'm driving, so forgive me. Here we go.
So I started searching for the house where my father grew up in Lvov, now Lviv, Ukraine. And I knew that we had his address in documents that my mother had saved. My father's 1932 certificate of citizenship had the address, Britannia 5. I then had to try and find a map of Lviv that was intelligible to someone from the West, because all of these maps were in Cyrillic. So I remember trying to find a Polish map, and I found 2 actually. So I set up 2 windows on the computer to compare the maps, and I was searching for landmarks. And I remembered my Uncle Sidney, my father's older brother, saying they used to walk to the opera. So you see, it says théâtre. And so I guided my cursor a bit south, and then I saw to the left, Britannia. And when I matched that to the Ukrainian map of today, it turned out to be Lesa Kurbasa. So I plugged that into my browser and I used Google Street View. And I found the house, and it was a stunning revelation. It was so thrilling to me. I decided after a little while that I wanted to take a virtual stroll. At the time that the house was built, which was 1907, Lvov was called Lemberg. So the city has had many names depending on who was in control. Lemberg was very much an Austro-Hungarian city. In fact, it was built to be a little Vienna, and you couldn't build any buildings by order of the emperor that were taller than the buildings in Vienna. And my mother had told us that it was special in some way, but she didn't quite remember in what way. And there before me was an amber-colored tiled building. The windows were framed by crisscrosses of majolica tiles in blue and ochre stylized lilies. And there was a cast iron door, and each floor above it had a balcony. I think it's important for people to go to the places that they're investigating, because you never know what you'll find, and you need to feel the atmosphere of a city or a place. So I was imagining my father scampering down the street and turning to that cast iron door and pulling it open and thinking about what kind of childhood he had in such a beautiful city.
Karen?
So in this excerpt of this segment, you see that research can be exciting and you can make unexpected discoveries. I mean, I was sitting alone at home when I made this discovery, and I just couldn't believe the beauty in front of me. It actually was bittersweet because I understood in a way why my father would not talk about the war and his youth, and that it must have been very difficult in some ways to leave such beauty behind. But what the discovery of the house gave to me, one of the things that I absorbed was the ability to imagine my grandmother, Michaela, sitting on one of the balconies. The second floor balcony actually was their balcony, sipping cafe and eating Windsor tort. And what I have been told is that that is a phenomenon called historical imagination, that had I not been able to anchor some aspects of her to the house and what it was like to live there, and look down on the street that I was standing on, I wouldn't have been able to imagine that. And I had never imagined what Lviv was like until that point, Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg. So one thing that you can do to help students get a sense of what that experience was like for me is to, and have them relate to it, is to suggest that they might think of a place that they've heard of but have never visited in reality, in the real world, and use Google Street View to explore it, and then talk about the difference between that virtual experience and not having seen the place in any other way, or perhaps just seen it in photographs or in 2 dimensions. I think that also the fact that I knew a little bit about the important landmarks from actually in this case from my uncle, like the fact that the family loved opera and could walk to the opera, really helped me when I was exploring with Google Street View. So that was the landmark where we showed the the footprint of the Opera House that helped me find the place.
So now we're going to move into Karen's father's experience at the University of Vienna. And this pulls in a lot of really interesting topics to discuss.
The time my father arrived there were riots all the time because the Austro-fascist students were constantly beating up the Jewish students. And it really was dangerous to go to anatomy lectures given by Professor Tandler, who was the chair of one of 2 anatomy departments. In the 1870s, there were 2 approaches. One group of professors favored looking at human anatomy for clinical purposes to better heal patients. The other branch was more interested in ethnic origins of those differences. So you start to see the seeds of their thinking in terms of racial superiority and inferiority. The Anatomy 1 amphitheater was on the 2nd floor of the anatomy building, and you would go up a very elegant flight of marble stairs and turn to the left. The fascistic anatomy students would go up a flight to the right to the 2nd anatomy amphitheater, and there would be lectured by Tandler's counterpart, Eduard Pernkopf, who was a member of the Nazi Party. The violence on campus was extreme, and the historians sent me historical accounts of what happened. They sent me newspaper clippings. And there was a student who was in my father's class who wrote a memoir, and she described one particular episode where the fascist students and brown shirts from Germany, who they invited to join them, invaded Tandler's anatomy amphitheater. Another classmate, Muriel Gardner, mentioned the same riot in her memoir. She was the real Julia, who Lillian Hellman wrote about in a short story that became the movie Julia. And at that time, in March 1938, when the Nazis arrived, it wasn't clear that he would be able to graduate because he was Jewish, and they were throwing out Jewish professors and students. But because my father was a foreign student and the Nazis were not yet interested in Poland, he was able to graduate in June. He left the frenzied streets of Vienna and the Austrians' rapturous embrace of the Nazis for his hometown of Lvov, which was relatively quiet. But I think he knew what was coming, that he had to get out of Europe.
So, what I find so fascinating and important to share with the students is the history of anthropology, phrenology, and the promotion of scientific anti-Semitism. And what's really interesting is to make it so contemporary for students today. There are 2 great books on this topic, Gods of the Upper Air, which is the history of anthropology, and Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. Both of them describe Nazis coming to learn about racism from Americans in the Jim Crow South. And I'll just summarize a section from Wilkerson's book, quoting Jonathan Spiro, that Hitler praised the near genocide of Native Americans. He was thrilled that Americans shot down the millions of Redskins. He saw U.S. Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, a model program of racial purification. The Nazis were impressed by lynching the subordinate African Americans, and having become aware of ritual torture and mutilations that typically accompanied them. Hitler marveled at the American knack for maintaining an air of robust innocence in the wake of mass death, but wondered why the Jews weren't included. And one other note, the last, almost the last clip we showed of the Viennese embracing Hitler with such passion in the street, such excitement, I think is worth having the students note. Where does that kind of passion come from? And what does it lead to? And why were they so excited to embrace Hitler? Karen.
Yeah, I would just like to say that my father arrived in Vienna in 1933, so that was 5 years before the Anschluss. And at that time, there was already in place a long tradition of duels on campus so that students could defend their honor if they felt slighted. And there were anti-Semitic riots on campus actually it goes back to the 1870s. And also when Tandler, the professor who you saw, the anatomy professor, was appointed to run one of two anatomy institutes in the 1920s. And Tandler was not only a professor of anatomy who had written several atomic atlases, which were extremely well respected. He was also a public official. He was the health commissioner in so-called Red Vienna, which is what it was called when the Social Democrats were in power. And they thought in terms of pooling their resources for the greater good. So, for example, young mothers were given layettes for free, and children were assured milk, because after World War I, there was a lot of rickets. And in fact, my father was one of those children who had rickets because his family fled Lvov and was in Vienna during World War I. Anyway, I mentioned Tandler calling these riots a reign of terror. And the University of Vienna had a rule, which was that the local city police were not allowed on soil to defend those who were under attack. And so by the time my father arrived in 1933 in the spring, Austro-fascist students regularly beat up Jews, socialists, and communists, either on the way to the anatomy class or during class. And you see in the movie Julia how that sort of melds that riot which was described by one of my father's classmates, melds into the Anschluss, which is, as I said, a few years later. And the discrimination that the Jews faced and the backlash is actually something that we have our own version of here. There were quotas in the United States up until the early 1960s that made it very difficult for Jews to be admitted to very fine schools, including the Ivy League. And there were tests that were designed that they would not do well on. There were subtle ways through legacy and so forth, to keep them out or find excuses to keep them out. And this is not unknown today. There was a recent Supreme Court case where there was an attempt to increase diversity in upper education that was struck down. And this is something that also can be discussed with your students. And it raises the question of backlashes to liberalization, like in my father's case and earlier in the 1870s. And you can raise the question about, should there be restrictions on who can go to college and who decides that?
So now we're going to move on to part 3. And this is taking a deeper dive into archives once you started the journey, and the kinds of surprises that you find. And indeed, before Karen had no idea when she was young that her father had a first marriage.
My father and Rose married in late February 1939. They didn't travel to New York together. I found out from the manifests on Ancestry.com that she sailed on an ocean liner called the Ile-de-France. Then the next question I had was, well, how did my father get to Mexico? And my mother saved his Polish passport from 1939. So I kept leafing through it. He left Lvov in mid-March and took the train through Western Europe to France, stayed in Paris, and then left for a port named Saint-Nazaire. And then below it is a stamp that certifies his arrival in Veracruz, Mexico. I thought, well, you know, May 1939, isn't that when the St. Louis crisis occurred? The St. Louis was a ship filled with Jews escaping Germany. No nation, including the United States, would accept them. So I went to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum site, and there I found an article that described the arrival of the St. Louis and 2 other ships, one of which was called Flandre. And I went back to the passport, and there, suddenly between these 2 stamps, I noticed something I had overlooked. Somebody had written Flandre. The Flandre, it turns out, was owned by a company called the French Lines. So I contacted the archivist there, and she said that the manifests had probably been destroyed to protect the passengers from the Germans. But she had the itinerary. I wanted to know whether Havana had been my father's destination as it had been the St. Louis's destination, or whether Veracruz was where he had initially intended to go. And on a whim, possibly even out of boredom one day, when I had subscribed to newspapers.com, I put in Rose Frenkel. And this is one of the finds that I find the most extraordinary, that my father's arrival in Havana was documented by a reporter for an Austin newspaper. And this feature describes Rose on the dock in Havana, arguing with a Cuban immigration official and saying, but why can't he come? And the immigration officer says, he can't because he's a Jew. And she says, yes, that was his first crime. He was born a Jew. No Jews were allowed to disembark, including my father.
Karen.
So you're getting a sense now of how little I knew about my father's life before the war and during the war. I didn't know anything about the violence he was exposed to at the University of Vienna. I thought that that since my father was a refugee and had spent the war not in Europe, but in the Caribbean, that he had not witnessed as much as one would have expected someone who was in Europe, as my mother was. And so I followed one lead after another. This is what we used to call shoe leather. You know, journalists would talk to sources and wear out their shoes going from one to another, getting tips from one another about who to talk to. In this case, it was, sleuthing the archives, and I felt that no question was too silly to ask or too far-fetched. And as you see, that persistence led to this major discovery of the ship that my father was on, and that his survival was interwoven with a very famous, much larger Holocaust story, which was of the St. Louis, and that his ship and the British ship passengers shared the same fate, which was that they could not get any asylum and were forced back to where they came from. There's a side story to this as well, which is that that the immigration policies in the United States were very, very strict. They had been implemented in the 1920s, and even though the humanitarian crisis unfolded 15 years later, there was a rigidity that had set in, and Cubans were told by German propagandists in advance of these 3 ships arriving that Jews were criminals and were going to take away their jobs. So there's a resonance there with some of what we've heard today. And the quotas were not even filled in the 1940s, when so many Jews were clamoring to get out of Europe. So it's worthy to consider discussing why this is still so sensitive today. And also the story of the importance of online archives of newspapers. And the story of what's happening to journalism. We know that that local newspapers are dying, and yet I couldn't have found out a very key part of my father's life without that story by the Austin Reporter. And I should tell you also that I did know, a year after my father died, I did find out with my sisters, and when we were going through my father's papers, that he had a first wife, but we had no clue about it until we were in our teens. This was in 1971 when we found out that he had this first wife, and my sister held up an envelope and said, "Mom, who is Rose Frenkel?" And she turned out to be a very interesting character. I spent a lot of time trying to understand her motivation for marrying my father. She was in Lvov right after Kristallnacht, probably in February of 1939. She and my father married, but they seem to have traveled separately, which is why he was on the Flandre by himself, not traveling back to the West, traveling to the West, as she was back home.
I think we should move on, Karen, because it's getting late.
Yeah, I'll just finish the sentence, which is that in those days, even if you were married to an American, you needed to have a visa, and she assisted in that visa. So, and the last thing I'll say is that the blatant anti-Semitism of the immigration officer is something we don't see explicitly in the press today, but it is a shocking thing to see it documented by that reporter. Okay.
And one assignment that might be interesting is to research the U.S. immigration policies, which I think, will find quite shocking. So now we'll move on to part 4. And this is when we go deep into the experience of the Holocaust through Karen's mother's story.
Prior to June 10th, we were told that anyone who did not work is going to be resettled.
The Germans decreed that anybody who was working in Tarnow had to have a special stamp on their work card. So I mentioned to the guide in the car that my mother had gotten this special stamp at Gestapo headquarters. And I see her fiddling with her phone, and she announces to me that we're going there. the guide told us that the building was now an apartment building and took us to the backyard where Jews were routinely shot.
Somebody shuffled me into the labor office. I think there was a mirror there. And as I walked in, I was pushed in. I realized that I was completely pale green. And I remember passing the desk of Grunov. Grunov was the head of Gestapo, I believe.
Gerhard Grunau, the famed Hitlerist hangman, arrived in the city. At that time, Grunau ordered the arrest of more than 100 people.
And he was a young, extremely handsome man, but there was madness in his eyes. Completely petrifying experience. May my composure, showed my documents, got a stamp. I did not know that this was a stamp to live.
They changed the rules again. The Nazi vice was closing in and forced even Jewish doctors into the ghetto. And so my aunt, my mother, and her 2 cousins went to live in a room with 9 other people, 1 room.
But this is where the realization that it's over permeated my consciousness. I really wanted to kill. Gun was out of question. Butcher knife. I wanted to kill Bruno because he would go through the ghetto, would shoot people. And I realized I cannot kill him because they would kill everybody on my street. In the meantime, my mother sent me false papers, proof of baptism. This was her report card. You'll be amazed. It bothered me that she was an F student. I think that somewhere along the line I made a decision that the best way to die was to walk out of the ghetto because they would shoot you on the spot. The occasion presented itself with a friend of mine. His name is Pelekvas, arranged for a man who has been delivering hay to his factory to take me out of ghetto. I didn't ask my aunt, I didn't ask her permission. I was ready and I left within 5 minutes. And I was wondering if these people were absolutely out of their minds to hide me. All of them would have been shot if I was found there. There was also an older brother who was also in hiding. He was the officer of the Polish army, and he took interest in me. He told me what was going outside of ghetto. He said, "You are too dark to survive in Western Poland. You have to go to Germany."
The Germans are short of labor because all their young men have gone to the front. And if you volunteer to be a slave laborer, you have a better chance of surviving.
Karen.
So I just want to say, I want to comment that this is an example of an eyewitness account, my mom's witnessing of the Nazi strategy to tighten the vice that would eventually culminate in the final solution. So she experienced this in the Tarnow ghetto, and right before that, when she got that work card stamp at the Gestapo headquarters. So, this is not distant history in my family. This is my mother talking about having seen this. And also I just want to say that she experienced terrible violence on the part of Grunau, as she says, who randomly shot people. And this is not unlike the random violence of Amand Goeth in Schindler's List, who went around the concentration camp of Prashu, randomly shooting Jews. And so it brings home the idea of the constant violence and terror that people face, which, having been shielded from it to an extent, was very hard for me to imagine as an American. And I'm sure it's hard for others. There also is an answer here given on the part of my mother to the question of that's often asked, which is why didn't the Jews resist? Why were they obedient? Why didn't they try harder to fight back? And here she explains in just one sentence that she was aware that had she done anything to take revenge on Grunau, everyone on her street would have been murdered. So that she was rendered helpless despite her desire to act and to resist. And finally, I just want to say that she was again very young when she made the decision to walk through the gates of that ghetto, and she was so desperate that she was willing to take that risk. And so this is a different kind of historical imagination, a different context, imagining what it was like for her to not only walk through those gates, but to be at the Gestapo headquarters and being terrified. And then, you know, in contrast to the beautiful experience of historical imagine that I had when I found the house in Lviv.
And then also the altruism and resistance of the people who helped her.
Right, and this is so crucial. The farmer, the Catholic farmer, and his brother, the officer in hiding. You know, why did they choose to help? What was the motivation there, and why did they have the ultimate empathy to help this young girl when their whole family could have been shot if she had been discovered there? So you can ask students to think about what it takes. How bad the situation in Poland have to get for people to do that? What would it take for them here to do that for someone else whose life was endangered like my mother's? And when is there or isn't enough reason to act? And this brings up the teachings of Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, who talks so much about bystanders and indifference. For him, evil is not action necessarily. It can be inaction, choosing to do nothing and be a bystander. And here we have examples of people who chose to help.
Okay, so now we go to the experience of danger and loss for Karen's mother.
Surely you will arrive, my dear, at the conclusion that actually these are only the extraordinary circumstances that occur during wars, and this one especially, which evoke this condition of strained nerves. Even though I realize that you work very hard, be satisfied with this situation because you are not in a concentration camp, nor do you have tuberculosis. This is nothing else, only a hard trial of life. This practical examination you must pass, and I'm sure you will pass. Next year in summer, we will take a trip to the Tatra Mountains. Smile at the future a little, and immediately it will be much easier. And this letter moves me every time, and I feel his vast love for his only child, with whom he was never to be reunited. And he is no longer my mother's father, he's my grandfather. And I'm very grateful to his words of wisdom that helped her through the war.
The letter reveals the kind of man he was, how he tried to teach me how to disassociate myself from the situation and to artificially build a sense of purpose and living as day by day I would be towards the end of the war.
No matter what he was suffering and the deprivation he and my grandmother Teofila were going through in Lvov, hidden in the area inside, he was racking his brains to give my mother courage and strength to get through her travails. And it worked, I think. because my mother obeyed him. And not only did she refer to these letters while she was a slave laborer, when we were little and after my father died, she would read and reread and translate and retranslate these letters because they were so precious to her. And it was the only guidance that she had from age 17 on. My grandfather's letter is followed by a fragment by Teofila. I don't go often out now because your uncle doesn't like it. My darling, write letters and have hope. I kiss you sincerely, Aunt Zosha. And I checked what was happening in Lvov in early June. At that point, 250,000 Jews, local Jews and refugees, were already dead.
The last letter is from July 2nd, 1943. My mother says, do not send anything to us at the present time. Send it to Aunt Frida. And when you write to her, put your address on the letter, not on the envelope. Well, of course, I knew that they were in mortal danger. That was the last letter.
We know from a family friend who was staying with them that my grandmother Teofila needed work and got a job.
I don't know why she took a job, which was total madness. If I were there, I would have never allowed that.
And on her way to work one morning on the streets of Lvov was denounced to be a Jew and picked up by the Gestapo. My grandfather Isidore and the family friend were both deported and put on a train bound for a concentration camp, but both of them jumped off the train, and the family friend fell and passed out. And when he awakened, there was no trace of my grandfather Isidore.
I spent a lifetime of despair that I didn't save them. And the whole thing is completely irrational. Because how can a 16-year-old girl think that she can save her parents?
The fact that my mother was forced by her parents to leave them in Lvov and separate to go to Tarnow was a blessing and a curse for her.
That, of course, has had a terrible impact on my whole life.
Karen, do you want to comment on that?
I just think maybe in the interest of time, I should just say that it was extremely lucky that my mother was able to get some comfort and guidance from her parents while she was a slave laborer. And I grew up, knowing that she relied on those letters in times of trouble after the war. And that's, I think that's enough, because we should move on.
So one performance task based on the letters is to ask students if there's an object that they or their parents or relatives care about that have no monetary value, but a lot of symbolic value. And it's a way to talk about symbolism and memory and how you remember through that. We had another segment, but we're almost out of time, and we want to talk about just a few other things before we go and open it up to the Q&A. And one thing is that the question of identity and silence are things that could be big questions you come to at the end of looking at all of the segments, and compare the students' version of identity before they saw this to how they would identify themselves now, to help them understand if, and hopefully they were changed by this experience. Karen, do you want to talk about silence?
Yes, I just like to say that many refugees, people who got out, European Jews who got out before the war, were silent. My father's silence was not that exceptional. I've heard from other children of Holocaust survivors. And I have been pressed to answer why I think he was silent. I understand his silence better now, but I was always very empathic, because I think that anybody who has experienced a suicide in their family, which is how my father's mother, my grandmother Michaela, died, finds it too painful to talk about. And here we have it in the context of one of the most horrific conflicts in history. So just to understand why I said that about my grandmother on my father's side was blonde and blue-eyed and could pass for not being Jewish. And she was found out by the Gestapo and chose to take cyanide rather than to take to be taken to the camps, or even possibly the Lvov ghetto, which and I say that because I don't know when the suicide occurred. But my father, I know, wanted to look to the future and leave that behind as much as he could, but also to protect my sisters and me from the horror of her fate. Having visited the house and seen where she lived, I have a little bit of solace knowing something about her, her surroundings and her taste. And I found out where she was born, which I didn't know either. So
So I think we should go to the discussion guide.
I want to say why this is relevant today. This is relevant today because all families have secrets, and there are questions that children are discouraged from asking. And you can talk with your students about what they think was the reason for silence on the part of my father and refugees, and how they if they've encountered something like that, how they felt about it.
Okay, so we want to show you a little bit of the discussion guide that could be useful to you. Okay, everything went really well till this. Okay, here we go. We have a film summary, introduction, which gives you some background, the terminology that students should learn before they watch the film, and then learning goals, questions to ask the students, such as, and then the issues that each segment brings out with references and hot links for you to help the students or have them do the research on their own, and performance tasks that they can do, and wrap-up questions, and references for you, like the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we do that for every one of the segments. So I just want to close before we have the Q&A with one thought. Being a professor myself, the classroom is a very sacred space, and it's only in places like that you can bring up these topics and have these discussions that will have great meaning. And it's a very privileged position for you to be in, to be able to do that with your students. Okay, Paul.
Well, I would like to say one thing myself,
Hmm?
which is that we're a little frustrated because we had actually 2 segments to show you. We could not, but there's also a more detailed version of both films, the 75-minute feature film and the 5-part series, in my memoir. I have written a memoir that was published about 4 weeks ago, which details what we couldn't visualize in this medium. And you can get it on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com and bookshop.org.
So thank you so much, Karen and Marcia, for a wonderful presentation. I thought it was really fascinating. I had a whole bunch of questions, but unfortunately for me, but fortunately for you, there are a whole bunch of other questions which we will address first. And Rachel will be moderating those questions. So I want to hand the mic over to Rachel.
So first question, which is posed to both Marcia and Karen, is, this was asked several times, if you have any recommendations for other documentaries that you want to show, perhaps some that are geared towards older students, like college age?
This is geared towards college students.
But we are going to send you a list of recommended documentaries that experts have given us. And then there are new ones coming out all the time. If you just look at Jewish film festivals, you can see a lot.
Well, that answers another question, which was asking about additional materials. So you already answered that. Another person wanted to know, what was the most rewarding part of creating this documentary?
Oh, I think meeting Karen's mother. Unfortunately, I never got to meet her. What was really interesting is at first I saw the Irina, who was not that sensitive. I just went for the sound bites that really pushed the story along. But as I got to know her and study her, I kept going back to find those moments of contemplation and insight that I might have missed before. And I was so impressed, so that Karen and I call it the duet that I created of she and her mother telling the story together.
And then we have a very specific question as well, relating to the study guide. There is a question about if there is a timeline that shows how Karen's mother's experience and father's experience were unfolding at the same time.
Well, we didn't think of that.
Well, no, I thought about it actually, but in a slightly different way. On the website for the memoir, I list my discoveries, and I do it for all of the threads. So there's my mother's thread, my father's thread, my grandfather, the sole surviving grandparent, on how he escaped to Palestine, and my great-grandparents, whose collection you have seen, the photographs and portraits in their archive that they brought with them when they escaped Berlin in 1940-41. Those discoveries are all listed on the website, familytreasuresmemoir.com.
Amazing. And as I am coming up with collecting the last few questions, I just want to let everybody know, if you have any final questions, now is the time to submit them in the chat. There was also a question about the use of violence in the classroom, which you addressed a little bit as well in your discussion. But someone was wondering how you thought through what is considered too violent to show in a documentary and what is considered appropriate.
I think what we show is all appropriate. We did have consultations with quite a few experts in Holocaust education, and we tried to be discreet, but it's always the question of running away from the violence, and that was so much a part of the Holocaust. So you don't want to totally avoid it. You want to give a sense of the horror and devastation of the violence. But we do not have any footage from concentration camps. We stood by what Karen's parents experienced, and they were not in concentration camps. Karen, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think that when we got the feedback about the pornography of violence and not having permission to show the women victimized and raped, we stepped back, and we had to really balance that the desire to not do that with also not wanting to sanitize the Holocaust. You know, it's very difficult, right? You want the students who are young to understand the horror, but you don't want to traumatize them by showing the trauma of the victims. So it's a very, very fine line that we walked as filmmakers. And I also have another comment that has not been asked, but I want to convey this, that one of the great challenges in filmmaking here was to balance all these threads, my thread, my arc of learning and understanding about the violence and more about my relatives, but not have the viewers feel torn or jerked from the Holocaust stories back to mine and my discoveries. That was a really big, big challenge that I think, I hope people will agree we managed to do, so that it flowed well and was kind of seamless.
I have one comment. For college age audiences, why not show the 75-minute? You have plenty of time. You have 2 hours or more, and you can show that and discuss all the details. All the segments you saw today are in the 75-minute as well.
Great. It looks like that is the end of our questions and answers. So I'm going to throw it back to Paul to close us out.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Actually, since we still have a couple minutes, I was wondering if I could ask one more question, Rachel, with your permission, of course, which is, I would like to know a little bit more about what Irina did when she was a slave laborer in Germany. I actually have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask that one for now.
Yes, I'll take that. My mother had 4 jobs. There was a call for laborers in when she was in a transit camp in Krakow for laborers in Bavaria. My mother responded to that one because she was imagining escaping through the Bavarian Alps. So she landed in a village called Holstadt. It really actually was not a village. It was a hamlet with a crossroads. And there she worked in the fall of 1942 for a farmer, and they were threshing hay, I think, and wheat, and cultivating turnips. And then he wanted to build a house, and she was helping him and carrying bricks and stuff like that. And she talks about how she was not a good slave laborer. She didn't have enough practice in lifting heavy things and so forth. And she got ill, and he wouldn't send her to a doctor. Thankfully, there was a frost, and she got a job in the hamlet for working for a family that had a store, a dry goods store. But that job was considered by the labor office to be too good for a slave laborer. So, and the family was known to be anti-Nazi, so they punished them, and they sent her to Bad Neustadt, which was a beautiful resort. And there she worked for a farmer who had a produce nursery, and she was his farmhand, and was starved and mistreated by him and his wife, and was very, very skinny, and timed a request from the commandant of the labor office to give her a job working in the Siemens factory, a local Siemens factory where they were assembling small appliances. That was a very courageous and dangerous thing to do, which she found out later she could have been shot for just making that request. But she was so desperate because she didn't think she was going to survive on the vegetables and potatoes. They took all her protein. They kept it for themselves. But she timed it with the consequences of the Battle of Stalingrad, and she knew that the Soviets were going to liberate Lvov, and no one could check that her papers were false. So that's what she did. She worked, the last job was in a factory.
Well, thank you so much. Obviously, your mother was an extraordinarily resourceful person, and hearing her story and the story of your father and hearing about your grandparents is really very inspiring. And I just want to thank you again. And I'd like to now do the concluding remarks, which is I want to thank Karen, thank Marcia, thank all of you, Rachel and Aaliyah, for joining us today. We will be in a few moments sending out an evaluation form and a CTLE application for all those who've participated. Tomorrow morning, we'll be sending out an email with some of the links that'll be relevant for this program and links for further inquiry. So looking forward to sending that out again tomorrow morning. Again, this program is our latest installment in the Vanya Gottesfeld-Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series, made possible by the generous sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, Vanya Gottesfeld-Heller and Joseph Heller, and through the generous support of the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. Again, for more information and to register for any of our upcoming events, please check your email for our e-blast featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website at www.mjhnyc.org and click events. And we look forward to learning with you in the future. And again, thank you to everybody. Have a great evening.